All right, so I want to talk to everybody a little bit about a few things. We're going to talk about damage assessments and some other stuff, and then we're going to review a paper as we do usually with these videos. So thank you for watching. My name is Dave Attell, and let's get started. So this Russian missile clip art that I legally licensed is sitting here because there's a piece of the puzzle that I think might be missing, and it's confusing to me. And it is, what is our actual battle damage assessment in cyber and around cyber? Because a lot of the activities we do, especially our country, what we do is often not a cyber response. So when someone hits us with cyber and we hit back with an indictment or sanctions, or putting someone on the entity list, et cetera, like who is responsible for saying that action had a measurable effect, and that measurable effect was what we wanted? So I don't know. This is just a question to everybody, because what I see is that we will do something like have a brief section. We have no follow through, by the way. We need to have follow through. That's another problem. But we'll have a brief statement like, okay, Positive Technology, you've done a bunch of bad things, right? So a paper came out from the Atlantic Council that described them, and it was pretty bad. And here they are communicating back and forth with like VMware about vulnerabilities, and they have this website, and they have like their conference still going on. And yes, they can't exchange money, but if you read the actual statement, you should never be visiting their website, right? Like they are an active, it'd be like visiting the SVR's website and clicking on like a JavaScript browser tester. Would you do that? Like you shouldn't. And yet here they are, right? So where's our follow through? Where's the assessment of, one, did what we do have effect? But two, is it properly limiting our risk? These are questions I have for our national security team. So I'm sure someone's on this. It'd just be good to know who. I'm actually not sure someone's on that. All right, so here's something else that I noticed, which is that this is a statement not from me. He says, some famous person says, when you're in a war, all resources are depleted. I think actually Robert Gates maybe said that. And here's what you can know right now is that our adversaries know what our total response capacity is, right? So that's not great. And it's roughly, 90% of a SolarWinds incident. But one thing I'm noticing is that like you have organizations in government that we are trying to ramp up, just ramp them up. But I feel like the only way to ramp them up is to start cannibalizing the very services that they're supposed to be supporting. And if that's true, we need to think about how to get around that, because, 240 pen tests is, it's a big, if that was a pen test company, that'd be one of the biggest pen test companies in the world, right? That'd be an NCC group. That'd be, one of the big ones. I don't actually know who out there is doing 240 pen tests per year, especially if they're reasonably sized. I mean, one pen test can be 3 people for 4 weeks. So I noticed they were hiring. I think they were filling one billet, which is not going to get them where they need to be. So anyway, as we shove money down that pipe, are we shoving money that's just taking the talent from the places that we need? So that's another question. And here's some other things that we need that we're not even talking about that we need, right? So we do need a government endpoint agent. We can buy one, we can build one. I'm sure we have some sitting around. And we need some processes around that and a team that maintains it and publicly discusses it. I think we can look at Ghidra, for example, as a way to do that sort of community building. And open source is a perfectly good model for this. And again, government standards for telemetry and database storage, right? So it's not just about getting the data off the machine. It's about how do you store it? We need a standard for that. What kind of database do you store it in? I prefer a graph database, but pick your poison and make it a standard. And how you do queries should be standardized. That's a thing that we should do. And then how you tell if two binaries are close or far is something that we need to standardize on too. So here's some open problems that I don't think anyone's working on right now. But again, Would love to be surprised. Okay, so those are like the, pressing strategy things that have been just stuck in there. I'm not on the RSA conference thing right now. Like, it's just a lot of noise as far as I can tell. And the website is even worse than the in-person experience. So that's happening right now. And there's some announcements there, I'm sure. I haven't seen anything come out of there, honestly, that I thought was really big news. I did see a team come out with a browser attack that uses Rowhammer, which people should be paying attention to, but they're not. I actually asked a question on Twitter. I was like, what if you were an APT, who only focused on like Rowhammer and then also like CPU information leaks? That's it. That's all you do, right? Like, what if that was your technique? And through that, you loaded various password stealers or whatever it is you need to do these days. So, I mean, that's a viable technique. And Dwizzle was like, yeah, that's my worst nightmare. He runs the Microsoft team that works on trusted computing. So actually, we were talking a lot recently about zero trust, and people are very confused about it. And Microsoft, I think, has a different take from a lot of the rest of the industry. And you'll see a big dichotomy there in like being able to trust the hardware and building really strong trusted platforms versus programmatically understanding the context that your authentication is happening in, which you'll see with like a Zscaler or an AppGate, right? So those are two completely different models that I still think it's worth knowing what you're talking about when you're talking about the different ones. So yeah, because everyone asks like, what is the difference between this and Kerberos? That is the pressing question when people talk about zero trust. So that's, as the buzzword gets bandied around in various government documents, that is something to keep in mind. Okay, let's talk about the paper, Achieving Systemic Resilience. I think it's a good paper. I gave it a B. B is a good grade. If my kids had Bs, I'd be pretty pleased. They do not have Bs or anything close to Bs. I don't know if you saw my last talk, but or a couple talks ago, we talked about there's only 4 different kinds of cyber policy papers. One of them is this idea of I'm building a new model and I'm portraying it to you and the world. I'm describing a model of thinking to you that I've constructed out of whole cloth. This paper is unique in some ways because it is built on other papers that are similar papers. So it's like model on top of model on top of model. The problem there is if you haven't read the other papers, you'd probably be pretty confused. So I'm going to go through it a little bit and try to describe it as I can go. Okay, Achieving Systemic Resilience in a Great Systems Conflict Era. I love the titles. So Chris is often she has a very poetic way of using language in her papers. And sometimes it's descriptive and sometimes it might confuse you. So just be careful about that. Okay, so when you talk about these types of papers, model papers, just to go a little bit more into depth for those of you who are international relations students or whatnot, there's 4 kinds of those. So there's taxonomic. This is people like, I'm grouping up stuff for you. I'm grouping this, and I'm grouping this, and I'm grouping this. There's brown ants, green ants, and red ants, and they're different, right? That's me describing them. So it's a description, right? And then descriptive papers we go into the details of what all those things are and what are their features and capabilities and all that stuff, right? So what is an APT that focuses on cybercrime, for example? So you sort of start tacking stuff onto there. And the next stage of your model is predictive, right? So I have a model that's good enough of the world that I can predict certain things are going to happen based on the inputs that I can see in front of me, right? So that's useful as well, right? That's a very useful type of thing. And it also lets you check to see if your model is in any way correlating with the real world. And then there's actionable models, which also tell you, in addition to being able to predict things, what you can tweak to have real world effect and how much real world effect you should see when you tweak something, right? So this is the final stage of a model. And so when you're reading one of these model papers, you have to figure out, where am I, right? So what is it? Now, most papers, because they're required to by some sort of academic standard, try to pretend that they are actionable, right? Like they're like, here's my model of the world, and here's what we need to do to fix it. But that does not necessarily mean you have the data in the model enough to even be able to do predictive. And I would say what we are with in this paper is a descriptive paper, right? This paper describes the system of the world, and you can buy into it or not. And, there's some actions that she would like the government and the rest of us to take based on that model, but it's not sort of a predictive model. So you're not going to see like, this is what I see happening in the world in the next X years based on the model that I've created and the input data that I am allowed to have. So, important to know. So, let's do some context, just context. So this is just from what the paper said as her biography. And I think it's very important. She has a really good talk on YouTube you can watch to sort of get another side of the story. But just in case you haven't, you should at least know it's part of a larger framework. And these are the basic things that she's working on, which is like what happens when you have Cyber Westphalia and all this. How do the sovereigns even work in this field? That I think is one of the weak points of not this paper necessarily, but all papers in this space in terms of their internal frame of. And what I want to do is take Snow Crash and like force feed it to the whole community, because Snow Crash is a post-Westphalian novel about cyber, essentially about cyber war, and it's one of the first cyberpunk books, right? It's right up there with The Long Run and Gibson's novels, right? So this is one of the first novels to really start thinking about it, and it still has relevance today. So that's the issue, right? So when we talk about a national socio-technical economic system, the problem with that phrase is the national, because that shouldn't be a given, and it isn't a given. All right, so even Robert Gates said the same thing. He said, if you listen to his podcast recently, which was oddly bad, it was an oddly bad podcast because the podcast people, I can't remember where I found it. They were just very weird. All right, they were pushing weird political points about like the 1976 thing versus the 1619 or whatever it was in the middle of what essentially should have been a historical review. So he says the same thing, though. He's like, look, there's two kinds of systems. There's essentially a democratic system and an national authoritarian system, and they're in great conflict, and we need to figure out how to win that conflict because we're not winning right now. Right? So the problem with this is, if you think about it, there's definitely elements in the United States and in other democratic countries that are national authoritarians. And there's elements in communist countries and other authoritarian countries that have leanings toward a more technical democratic economic system, right? And so like some of the large companies inside China come to mind, right? So they have differing values. That is a problem for this entire style of model, right? So immediately I was like, okay, how does that glitch in the system affect the rest of the model? So she makes a big point. There's a whole lot in here about people, please stop saying great power competition and replace it with great systems conflict. And it's almost like a looping argument in that sense, in that she is like, you need to start thinking in this way so that we can organize in this way, essentially, so we can push toward this kind of organization. That's not a bad thing. That's just the scope of the paper. These are some of the themes that you're going to see. I do not like it when people say bad actors in a paper like this, because bad actors is a value call on someone else's motivations, and they should, realistically, you have adversaries, and she mentions adversaries. You don't need to call them bad. She has, like a lot of people do, a great hatred for the technical debt built into the design of the internet. I don't share this, but that is part of the paper. So great power competition is canceled. The assumed automatic alignment of advanced democracies I thought was very interesting. And also the assumed alignment internally to their societies I thought was very interesting. And I didn't think it was actually correct. But it's in the paper. So anyway, so here's some things. I really liked this perspective of how you build essentially systems that are resilient, right? So this is some of the best work in this space is probably in the ecology. How do you get there's some really new, interesting work in how do you get a savanna? Like why are grasslands a thing, right? Like, and they're all over, right? So like why are savannas so resilient to being savannas and not forests or marshes or other things? And how do these big systems sort of self-regulate? There's some really good stuff there. But if you don't feel like reading a bunch of biology papers in your spare time, here's a cool numbered list. So I liked her numbered list. So they're worth, picking up. It's good. And actually, it's good to think about this if you want to think of it as like, how does your immune system work? Your immune system has slack in time. It has redundancy in knowledge. It has discovery, trial, and error learning. It has collective sense making up to a point. It has proactive action arrangements and the capability to act, right? So, and we know when these things exist because we know when they fail, and we get very sad. And of course, it gets practiced all the time, as you know. Anyway, so that one thing that I think is good about this phrase is resilient systems is not purely political systems, right? So it's not that specific. So here's part of the problem, though, is that she said, piece of the paper here, she's like, systemic resilience becomes a priority strategic imperative. And what you should think while you're reading this paper is, what do nation states have to give up in order to achieve systemic resilience? What do they have to reform? It's not just about building or new organizations, a new CISA, a new whatever. If you want like systemic resistance against the Chinese dividing our society, then sometimes you have to find ways to cover up the cracks in our society, right? Like police reform would be a big one, right? So there's others, but like just to say, like when you see what the adversary is poking at, you don't have to form a new group to fix it. You just fix it, right? So some of these things like, what if we gave up the war against end-to-end encryption, right? Just give it up and stop trying to hang it like an albatross around our necks every time we go to talk to any private company and they're like, we're not on board because of all these other things that you're doing to us, right? So, you see like what are the barriers to us getting a lot of stuff? Well, it's liability protection when it comes to information sharing, right? So all these things like I think it's hard to just say we need a new organization without saying what is it we're going to give as a nation, as a Westphalian institution to make this happen. So, while it seems to create a consensus rhetorically, the term, I just love this phrase, bad analogies lead to bad strategies, right? So I loved it. And being misaligned with the deeply digitized world around us. So sometimes you should just appreciate the poetry in the language of the papers you read, which is not always true, but in some of these papers, you just get a little bit more sparkle. So this was definitely one of the good ones, I thought, in terms of that stuff. Okay. So here she said something, and I was a little confused. She's like, so some of the arguments in the paper as you're going through, she's like, size may not prevent the harm if the integration of transactions is so rapid that all elements are infected, affected, or disrupted nearly simultaneously. And every paper in the journal this was in was about COVID or had to include some like COVID spices. But in this case, I think stealth and covertness and the natural fog of war of cyber is maybe more pertinent. So how does that affect what the rest of the model was a question that I had in my head as I read the paper. So the question she asked, she's like, it's worth asking why recent successes in election defense have not been pivoted to healthcare defense. First of all, I think they're different problems. I don't think the answer is a lack of resilience mindset so much as just different problems and, of course, different complete structures to handle those things. But I also think the structures that we did have when it came to a healthcare system were sabotaged because of other issues in our system, right? So that's a problem that you would address with a strategic resilience issue. Some of these are very hard problems. And so the diagrams, again, the 5 offensive advantages, these all come from other papers and other models that she is incorporating in this larger model. And I like that she is doing that. That's really good. But it's worth pointing out that if you haven't read all the other stuff, and you might not always agree with that stuff, right? So you might not agree that these are the 5 offensive advantages. You might think proximity is not an advantage, whatever. So it doesn't matter too much, but worth... This is the kind of diagram, honestly, I think you have to really talk through, like verbally. I don't necessarily know that papers can use. It's a little complex for me. Anyway, so let's go to part 2, what to do about stuff, right? So here's my model. Here's what we're calling for. And the paper often is calling for more regulation and centralized control, which I thought was a very interesting take. So anchor organizations, a very large government approach. I don't know that that's realistic, is I guess what I came across when I was reading it. I don't know that governments at all are going to have an anchor organization and be able to... You have to ask, is that going to happen, right? Like, you can actually look at this paper. It's 2 different papers, right? The model and then what the proposal is. And if you like the model, you can like the model without liking the proposal, and vice versa, actually. So that's something you should look for when you're reading papers is there a natural segmentation in the paper that allows me to analyze them separately, right? So only the government of a democracy has... No, it's not true that the electorate, only the government has the electorate's mandate, because Google has a mandate, Microsoft has a mandate, lots of people have mandates to make decisions on their behalf and take actions on their behalf. The iPhone and Apple has a mandate, and that mandate is to get the government out of the iPhone. And if you think that that's not the case, then I guess you have to negotiate with Tim Cook a bit more, right? So anyway, an alliance. Okay, every time people talk about alliances, one of my early business early business mentors was like, look, partnership means one of you two is getting used, right? That's what that means. And so, and as I entered partnerships, especially with bigger companies, I definitely noticed that we were not getting the big side of the revenue pie, even if we were doing the majority of the work. So an alliance is a bit like a partnership, but just with better PR, right? That's the truth. The proposal for like a large alliance behind sort of allied nations, in this case, like big democracies, Western Europe and the United States and other, democratic nations, to have an alliance in this sense means you have to assume that the values and priorities are roughly similar. And they are in one sense of avoiding a massive onslaught from the Chinese authoritarian model. But in other senses, let's say privacy, for example, they're not aligned, right? So it's good to keep an eye on that as you read the paper. Okay, so governments matter to systemic resilience and must be directly involved. I don't know that this is true. I really don't. I think they should be involved. They have equities involved. I just, as you're reading this, you have to take a little bit more of a skeptical eye for some of that. I could be wrong, of course. Okay, so 2 experiments with creating so here, and I think it was key, is that she used anchor organizations that are national cybersecurity centers, right? So I think a good one would have been to use the Chinese anchor organization, right? They have an information security directorate. But so here's 2, right? Like the Israeli, and I just wanted to point out that when she does find an anchor organization, I mean, why is our anchor organization not NSA, right? Or Black Hat, right? So here's the Resilience Alliance. And I almost feel like Black Hat or RSA's conference community, like that whole community, there is a community. An alliance. What's the difference between an alliance and a community? Is it that the alliance has specific mission statements? I think the the RSA community, that style, and I don't want to give them too much branding here, but they have an aligned mission as well. Anyway, so that was something I just thought, you know, just because it's not owned by the government doesn't mean it's not a national anchor organization. So that's something you should keep an eye on as you read her paper, which I still recommend you do. You can't just watch my discussion of it. I guess you could just literally watch my discussion, but nonetheless. Okay, so a shared adaptive sensor mitigation. None of these are bad ideas. They all require investment, massive investment. So that's something to keep an eye on. And you will again and again see just a lot of papers where people are like, oh, the internet is just shoddy substrate. And at this point, it's like arguing about amino acids in DNA. Like, these are the ones you're going to be using, so they're just let it go. That's just the way it is, right? You're not going to bake your democratic values, which, again, are not agreed upon in all of your democracy, into another network. And if you did, there would be resistance from all sorts of people who have stakes in that. So, I mean, that's just the way it is. That's the way it is. Again, this is the conclusion of the paper. I thought it was very worth reading, so I just included it wholesale. Like, imagine a different world where we actually recognize that this model exists and is struggling, and we're able to put our resources together to fit it properly, and we're able to succeed. And authoritarian governments did not get their way. They did not get their way. So, yeah, I think when I read the paper, it was almost like things are not going well. We need to fix this. Let's take drastic action. Here's the drastic action. Here's a model that supports the particular action that we will take together. That's where you see language like, if we do not hang together, we most assuredly will hang separately, is when the author wants drastic action taken immediately if possible. So I guess my conclusion after reading the paper is I really liked a lot of it. I would say I would quibble with some of the pieces of the model. And because of that, I would quibble with the recommendations section. And I think you should too. But I did think it was, of this paper type, I really like papers that are, pushing forward and a coherent idea. So that's what you're getting. Fun to read, claps. Do I think it's going to have an impact on how we structure cyber defense? I don't know. I guess that depends on how much you like this video, I guess. So that's all I had. So thank you for watching this video, and hopefully you're enjoying these papers. Again, I have that big spreadsheet. You can read every paper that I read. I keep it updated. And if you have any comments, then please, I guess, click that subscribe button and then leave an annoying comment, and that'll be awesome. So thank you so much. Bye.